Could there be actual history behind the Loch Ness Monster? Nessie is Scotland's most famous mythological beast, and for good reason. She's been spotted by locals and tourists over 1,100 times at this point. But what I'm concerned with is the history behind her story. Where did she come from, and why? Myths are always a product of their times, and historical context can tell us a lot about how they came to be. So for me, I want to know when stories about Nessie began, what was going on in that period of time, and how the legend changed over time. We've done that with a few myths at this point, like with the Headless Horseman, and I've got a couple more in the works on the Jersey Devil and the Wicker Man. But for today, let's explore the history of the Loch Ness Monster. So first, some geographical context. Loch Ness is up in the Scottish Highlands. It basically points at Inverness. And some of you might hear the word Scottish Highlands and immediately think about Claire and Jamie from Outlander. I mean, I sure do. But the Highlands are home to a lot of famous sites, like for example, the UK's tallest mountain, Ben Nevis, or maybe the UK's largest national park, the Cairngorms. There's also the Isle of Skye. Yes, a whole bunch of scenes from Outlander were filmed there, and also some scenes from Harry Potter, like the famous train scene. You know the one. And if you're from the Highlands, or at least more familiar with it than I am personally, then share with us in the comments some places we definitely have to check out the next time that we're there. It's been a while since I visited Scotland. I'm definitely overdue for a trip. Now, Loch Ness is a long, skinny lake that, again, like I said, kind of points right at Inverness, right in the heart of the Highlands. But don't let the description fool you. She may be skinny, but she's not small. Loch Ness is about 23 miles long, that's 37 kilometers. It's 1.7 miles wide at its widest point, so that's 2.7 kilometers, give or take, and its deepest point is 755 feet, or 230 meters. It is the second largest and second deepest loch in Scotland. The largest, which I've actually been to, is Loch Lomond. It's about an hour outside of Glasgow. And the deepest is Loch Morar on the Western Highlands, looking out over the Isle of Skye. But because Loch Ness is so long and so deep and nestled up in the Highlands where there are fewer people than down in cities like Edinburgh and Glasgow, it became the perfect place to house potentially a mythological beast that's said to resemble a long, serpentine monster not unlike a plesiosaur, Nessie. So where does Nessie come from? Well, let's go back to the first recorded mention of her, which is in the 6th century CE, that's the 500s, in the biography of Saint Columba. To simplify it, Columba was a missionary who was credited with spreading Christianity to Scotland. He left Ireland and settled in Scotland around 563 CE to convert the Picts to Christianity. The Picts lived in Scotland from the 4th century until about the 9th century, and we get the word Picts from the Romans, who called them Picts Picti, or the painted ones, for they used to paint their bodies. It was a way of distinguishing them. They certainly looked different from the other groups that the Romans came across. And if you're wondering why I said they lived until the 9th century, it was kind of a weird way I phrased that. They disappeared as a separate group from written historical record. They weren't all killed. They ended up just merging with the Scots and then also the Gaels from Ireland. Now, to convert the Picts, Columba wanted to perform miracles to show them the might of God, and his most famous miracle was banishing the monster into the depths of Loch Ness. We get information about Columba's life and his battle with Nessie from Adamnan of Iona, an abbot who wrote a biography about Columba sometime between 697 and 700 CE, which is about 150 years after Columba even came to Scotland, which is interesting. But it's one of the few surviving early medieval Scottish works, and it gives us good information about the Picts and those early days of Christianity in Scotland. But considering it was written so long after the events in the book, as always, we need to take this source with a grain of salt, right? We can't assume that everything in it is exactly as it happened and hasn't been, what's the word I want to use? Exaggerated? And also, because the Loch Ness Monster isn't real. There's that too. Now, book 2, Chapter 28 of the biography of Columba is titled, How an Aquatic Monster Was Driven Off by Virtue of the Blessed Man's Prayer. And it is the first known written source of the Loch Ness Monster. So here's how the story goes, according to Adamnan. Quote, on another occasion, when the blessed man was living for some days in the province of the Picts, he was obliged to cross the river Nessa, the Ness, and when he reached the bank of the river, he saw some of the inhabitants burying an unfortunate man, who was a short time before seized as he was swimming, and bitten most severely by a monster that lived in the water. But the monster, which, so far from being satiated, was only roused for more prey, lying at the bottom of the stream, and when it felt the water disturbed, suddenly rushed out, and, giving an awful roar, darted forward with its mouth wide open. Then Columba, observing this, raised his holy hand, while all the rest, brethren as well as strangers, were stupefied with terror, and invoking the name of God, formed the saving sign of the cross in the air, and commanded the ferocious monster, saying, Thou shalt go no further, nor touch the man, go back with all speed. Then, at Columba's voice, the monster was terrified, and fled more quickly than if it had been pulled back with ropes. Then the brethren, seeing that the monster had gone back, were struck with admiration and gave glory to God in the blessed man, Columba. End quote. And that is the first ever mention of Nessie in the historical record. She took a chunk out of some Pictish guy swimming in the lake, Columba yelled at it and gave it the Gandalf treatment, and then the beast was cast back into the depths of the loch, and it's been there ever since. So, why then? Why was that the beginning of the Loch Ness Monster? What is the historical context here? Why didn't we hear about it earlier? Why not way later, right? Like, why that particular moment in time? Well, I've hinted at it already. Religion. If we know that the Picts were around until the 9th century in Scotland, then we know the Christian missionaries were likely still there converting them at the time that Adamnan wrote his book. The entire second book of his biography is called On His Miraculous Powers, which suggests that God, through Columba, was demonstrating the power of Christianity and its ability to help the people. So by writing that Columba, with his divine power, was able to defeat a beast simply by yelling at it, it's a way of showing the Picts and any other unconverted people reading the biography that Christianity was in fact the way to go. We perform miracles, follow our faith, look at how Columba just fusro-dod the monster back into the lake. Believe in God, right? It was their way of converting people. And from that initial mention onwards, the Loch Ness Monster was a local legend, a piece of Scottish folklore, a mythological beast. But despite that, sightings were infrequent, actually. There were only 21 recorded sightings between the 1500s and 1800s, which I actually find odd because typically we see a massive upswing in mythology and superstition in the early modern period. I mean, it was the time of the Pendle Witches in England, the Salem witch trials in New England. We've got vampire panics throughout Europe. We've got werewolf sightings. There are tons more things I could add to that list. But my point is that mythology and legends were rife in the post-medieval, pre-modern world. We can probably attribute the lack of stories about the Loch Ness Monster because there were fewer tourists in the area, so therefore fewer sightings, because there were some other cool folklore tales that are surrounding this lake. It's not just Nessie. One, for example, involves a kelpie, a Scottish water spirit that often takes the form of a horse. Kelpies live in lakes and rivers. Humans are drawn to them almost like sirens, and after they hop on the horse in an attempt to claim it for themselves, the kelpie goes back into the water and drags the person down into the depths into a watery grave. Come to think of it, my sister Paige used to call me Kelpie. Probably not because of the drowning. Probably not. So in one of many local folk stories, there was a kelpie that lived on the shore and woodlands near Loch Ness. It had a beautiful saddle and a bridle which caught the attention of a local named James McGregor. He didn't try to mount the kelpie though, because he had heard stories about what the kelpies do and he wasn't looking to die that day. So instead, he used his sword to cut off the bridle, managed to get it off, and then ran back home. Once removed, though, turns out the bridle was the source of the Kelpie's powers. So now that he no longer had his bridle, he could no longer harm the people around Loch Ness. But apparently in this story too, the Kelpie was like wailing and begging for its bridle back, but McGregor refused to give it back, and I understand why, but it kind of makes me feel bad for the Kelpie, to be honest. Maybe it's because our names are really similar. Could be that. But I'm also noticing a lot of similarities between that story and the original Nessie story with Columba, saying that the people of the Highlands need to be saved from this horrible mythological beast that lives in Loch Ness. For a while, that's all we have on the historical record anyway. Folk stories like the one about the Kelpie and the one about Columba and the beast, and just legends. It's just a handful of people who reported seeing beasts around the lake because the folk stories exists. And the Nessie that you're imagining in your head right now, the one that most people associate with Loch Ness, that version didn't even exist. Not anywhere close to it. Things started to change, though, for the myth in the 20th century, that's the 1900s, as more people had the money and the time to travel, especially after the Great War. Things are a little different for World War II. But after the Great War, people are starting to travel, and they go up to visit the Highlands. And Nessie sightings also increased in this period of time as the area grew and people started to come to it. And the most famous of all Nessie sightings happened in April of 1933. Aldi and John McKay were driving down the A82 that runs parallel to the lake and just takes you right up to Inverness. And less than a mile from shore on this drive, they reportedly saw, quote, an enormous animal rolling and plunging on the surface. And they described it as whale-like. The story was picked up by the Inverness Courier newspaper and published on May 2nd, 1933, where the creature was labeled a monster. And then from there, it spread to newspapers across the country, like London, who picked it up, and from there it kind of became global. It became such a big deal, in fact, that a circus offered £20,000 sterling reward for capturing Nessie alive. So you've got Nessie, this potential ancient monster who lives in the deep, dark Scottish Highlands lake. You could see why it became a global phenomenon. That's quite the story. Now, later that year, George Spicer and his wife saw, quote, a most extraordinary form of animal cross in front of their car. And this is where we get our modern interpretation of what the Loch Ness Monster looks like. A large body with a long, wavy neck. Spicer described it as, quote, the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal that I have ever seen in my life, with a long neck which moved up and down. It needs to be mentioned, though, that Spicer likely got this image from the dinosaur from the King Kong movie, which was popular in theaters at the same time as his supposed sighting. Now, from there, we get more and more sightings, but we also get photographs. And the most famous of these is the surgeon's photograph from 1934. You know the one. It's the black and white image of Nessie's thin little neck sticking up above the water and like maybe some of one of its like humps, right? It's not the first image, but it's the most enduring image. And if you know anything about Nessie, you've probably seen this picture. Now, in the years since, there have been more and more sightings, but also scientific explorations to determine whether there is a dinosaur-like creature hiding out in the bottom of the loch. Could it have been possible that a dinosaur was held over and somehow survived all of this time in the very deep, very dark Loch Ness? Well, people went out to try to answer that question. Earlier expeditions used sonar, sound navigation and ranging, which of course uses sound waves to detect objects. And in the 1960s, sonar operators claimed that they detected large moving objects deep in the lake. But there was never anything conclusive found. In 1975, an expedition used sonar and underwater photography, which produced a photo that kinda maybe looked like a flipper of some sort, but again, nothing concrete. And expeditions like this carried on through the 80s, through the 90s. They still sometimes happen in the modern day too. But in 1994, it was revealed that the surgeon's photograph, the really famous black and white one, was in fact a hoax, and the whole thing was made up, right? Because of course it was, because Nessie is not actually real. But Nessie's popularity is higher than ever. There's a whole tourist industry around the whole idea of the Loch Ness Monster. Whether people believe it or not, it's a part of the area forever. So although we know that the Loch Ness Monster isn't real, why does the collective population want so desperately to believe in its existence and its history? Well, the founder of the Loch Ness Project, naturalist Adrian Shine, does a really good job of explaining why we're so obsessed with Nessie, which I'll paraphrase. We love the idea of big, hidden creatures, right? It's why we love Godzilla films. It's why we like King Kong. It's why with this whole new age monsterverse that Universal's trying to do with the Hollow Earth, right? Like, we love the concept of some big kaiju hiding out somewhere on our planet that we just don't know about. So, we love the idea of big hidden creatures, but to be hidden, they need to live in lost worlds. And Loch Ness, dark and deep, is like a lost world, which is why the legend of the Loch Ness Monster persists to this day. It's the same reason that creatures like the Jersey Devil lives in the Pine Barrens, camps out there in the deep, dark parts of the Pine Barrens where people don't go very often, right? Or even the Knot Deer, who skulks around the Tennessee Appalachian Mountains. There's something alluring about these deep, dark, very old, and magical places of our world, and we like to think that in that history, there's still a little bit of mystery. My name is Kelly Beard, and thank you for listening to this short history of the Loch Ness Monster, a beast from the manuscripts of 6th century Scotland that lived as a folk legend until it became a global phenomenon in the 1930s. If you enjoyed this episode, go check out some of my other history minis, or you can listen to some of my longer podcast episodes. But make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any more bloody, gross, mysterious, or weird stories from our history.